I never imagined that a string of ordinary rides in ordinary taxis would leave me with a knot in my chest that I could not untie. It started the summer I turned 32, when I took a month off work to drive and to ride through 3 coastal cities, thinking that hours in a cab could be a quiet way to pass time, to think, to listen to strangers. The first trip began in Portland on a humid Saturday night in July. I remember the smell of rain on hot asphalt as I climbed into a black sedan by the old bus station. The driver called Sam, his hands leathery from years behind the wheel. I was alone, a flimsy backpack at my feet, and I wanted nothing more than to watch the city blur past the low yellow light. For days, I treated taxis like floating rooms, each meter a new small story. Drivers who became temporary historians, passengers who would confess small regrets and funny childhood memories. On the 4th night, a single lock and a single refusal would change how I thought about being alone in a closed car with a stranger. The weather was the same that night as it had been most nights, a damp coolness that clung to my jacket and to the seat fabric, the radio playing a half-familiar song. Everything felt normal until the car came to a hard stop and I heard a voice from the back that did not belong to any passenger I had seen that week. I was in a cab because I had missed a bus. I was in the wrong part of town for a walk. I was sitting in the middle of the back seat with my phone in my palm when the man in the front, the driver, said nothing and refused to unlock the doors. What happened in that ride and the 3 that followed would make me question how little training, how little oversight stands between us and danger in a small enclosed space. If this is the first time you are here, subscribe for more first-hand accounts of trips that did not go as planned. The city, the date, and the context of each trip are important, so I will start with where and when and how ordinary it all was, and with the people I met along the way. My life before those nights was steady and, I thought, simple. I had grown up in a small lakeside town, the kind where everyone knows your middle name. My father worked nights at a factory, and my mother taught math at the high school, and both of them loved routines so much they made rituals out of them. I moved to the city in my mid-20s to chase a job in publishing that lasted longer than I expected. I was a careful person by training, prone to making lists and checking locks twice. Travel became my way to break monotony without breaking myself. I wanted to know the texture of different nights, the sound of breaks in neighborhoods I did not yet know, the way strangers folded their stories like paper and handed them to me in 5-minute segments. For 3 months before that summer, I had been drifting between freelance gigs, saving money and sleeping in hostels, and I had started taking more taxis than buses because I liked the anonymity of a back seat where I could both listen and stay hidden. That backstory is important because it explains why I was alone so often in an enclosed car and why I trusted too willingly the routine of locking doors and leaning back. The people who would intersect with me over those weeks are worth naming because each one mattered. There was Sam, the driver, late 50s, rough voice, cigarette smell that never left his clothes. Elena, the dispatcher, 29, who took calls with a calm like she was placing chess pieces and who later called me back to check on me. Marcus, a passenger I met on the tram, who later hailed a cab with me and who became an eyewitness in a way he did not want to be. Officer Ruiz from the local precinct, short and blunt and precise with his questions. Detective Morales, who later led the investigation and whose voice sounded exhausted on the phone. Nina, the teenager with a backpack too big for her small frame, who once rode in the seat in front of me and told a joke about her cat that still makes me smile. Peter, a hotel clerk who had an uncanny way of knowing who was lying. Javier, a security guard at the waterfront who watched me get into that black sedan and later testified. That is 8 names, each a small anchor in a long story. The first of the 4 rides that felt wrong began as a simple pickup outside a dive bar on Northwest 3rd. The driver was Sam, and the interior smelled like stale coffee and ash. I slid into the back, said the address, and he started the meter. 23 seconds into the ride, a man in the front seat leaned over, not toward the road, but toward the back, and said something to no one. I heard it, but I cannot be certain what I heard because his words were swallowed by the engine. The light inside the car was the pale green of a street lamp cutting through rain. Then the engine rattled and the car stopped in an unlit part of the road. "Is everything okay?" I asked. He did not answer right away. The radio clicked and fizzed as if someone were turning a dial searching for a station. He reached for the central lock and his fingers paused over the button. "Please unlock the doors," I said. "Why?" he said. "Because I need to get out," I answered. He laughed softly and said, "Not yet." "You need to let me out now," I said louder. "I told you, not yet," he said, and there was something in his voice that made my palms sweat, a low casualness that did not belong to a man who had passengers. At that point, Sam said, "Nobody needs to panic here," in a voice that did not match his hands, which were steady on the wheel. "I am not panicking," I said. "Just open the doors." He kept them locked. The smell of rain mixed with a metallic tang, like coins left too long in a pocket, and the vinyl seat warmed to my thigh with his presence. My heart hammered, and my mouth tasted like old pennies. Marcus had come into the car with me, but his door had stuck when he tried to close it, so he stood with one foot still on the curb, half in and half out. "Hey, what is this about?" he said, and the driver told him to sit down and be a good man. "Just take us to the street corner," Marcus said. "I will," the driver answered, but he did not move the car. The exchanges in that cramped, tense scene lasted like seconds and years. There were at least 8 exchanges between the 3 of us, rapid, clipped, full of escalating fear and attempts at reason. "Open the door," I demanded. "Not yet," he said. "Who are you?" Marcus asked. "Driver," he replied. "Who sent you?" I asked. "No one sent me," he said. "We will not go anywhere if you do not open the doors," Marcus said. "I said, not yet," the driver repeated, and there it was, the refusal that shifted the night. The second ride happened 3 days later, and it carried a different kind of wrongness, quieter and colder. I was on my way to a ferry terminal when a woman named Nina climbed into the cab, soaked to the bone in the rain, her hair plastered to her forehead. She smelled like shampoo and orange peel, and she had a bruise at the edge of her collar that she tried to hide. We talked like strangers do, quick facts about the weather, the ferry schedule, the price. The driver that night was Elena on a temporary shift, and she hummed softly to the radio like she knew every melody by heart. Halfway through the ride, Nina said a sentence that made the hair on my arms stand up. "He kept asking me if I liked being watched," she said, looking at the window and not at us. "Who?" I asked. "My boyfriend," she said. "He sits in the front and watches my back while we ride." Elena did not react at first. Then she said, "Do you want me to stop somewhere?" And Nina said no, that she just wanted to get off at the ferry. "You can trust the driver," Elena said to her, and I remember thinking how strange it was to hear a stranger reassure a passenger about trust in a confined space. The exchanges in that ride were calmer, but they carried an undertone of menace, a slow drumbeat. We had at least 4 direct back and forths between Elena and Nina, and 2 with me interjected, each sentence like a step into colder water. The third episode I want to tell you about occurred late one Sunday when I took a cab from a quieter neighborhood after a dinner with friends. The driver had a name tag that read Javier, and he had a soft voice and a tendency to talk to himself. He asked me about books and where I wrote, and then, without prompting, said, "I have passengers who tell me too much." "Like what?" I asked. "Like that they hear things in the vents," he said. I laughed nervously, and he said, "No, that is true. Last week, a man screamed into his phone and said someone was banging the side of the car." The laugh died in my throat. "That is not normal," I said. "People are weird at night," he said, but his knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and his breath smelled faintly of peppermint and something darker that I could not name. Those 3 early stories built a hum of unease that narrowed the space inside taxis until the final ride became unbearable. The last ride, the one the title points to, took place on a rain-dull night, 3 in the morning when I thought I could sleep in the back seat of a cab and wake up near my motel. The driver was later identified as the man who refused to unlock the doors, and his name came up in a series of complaints that, in hindsight, fit together like a torn map. In that ride, the car felt like a small sealed room, the windows fogged in breath, and the radio turned to white noise. The man in the front spoke to me without turning his head. "Where to?" he asked. "The motel on Harbor Street," I said. "You paid cash?" he noted. "Yes," I said. "Good," he said, his voice flat. He did not turn the key to move the car. "Is something wrong?" I asked. "Not yet," he said. I felt foolish then, guilty for being afraid when there could have been a simple explanation, and I asked if he was okay. He said, "I am fine," and then his right hand hovered near the central lock, not pressing it. I could feel the breath of the man between the seats like a small wind. "Please unlock the doors," I said. He shook his head slowly and again said, "Not yet." At that point, my phone had no signal, and my fingers fumbled to find the emergency call. Marcus had walked away at an earlier corner, and I was alone. The exchanges were clipped and many, at least 7 direct back and forths, voices, meeting and clashing in the small space. "Open the doors," I insisted. "No," he said. "Why are you doing this?" I demanded. "Because I can," he said. "Do you understand what that means?" I asked. He smiled in the dark, not a friendly smile, and said, "Yes, it means you are with me now." The sound of rain on the roof became a metronome. I remember feeling every texture inside the car, the cool plastic of the interior, the damp wool of my jacket against my knee, the taste of adrenaline like metal on my tongue. Then there was a sudden sharp knock at the left rear window, a sound like a fist or a tool. "Who is that?" he said, and then forced a laugh that did not reach his eyes. I banged on the window with my palm and shouted for help. The knock was repeated and loud. Someone outside tapped the glass again, and the driver finally turned to look. For a moment, there was a window of normality. "Are you okay?" the figure outside asked in a hushed voice. "Yes," the driver said immediately to the stranger, and then he unlocked the doors with an annoyed sigh, and we spilled out into a strip of light near the motel. In the scramble that followed, there were words said, a handful of them sharp and destroying, many more that were simple questions. The man outside turned out to be Javier, who had been at the waterfront earlier that evening and had followed his intuition when he saw a cab stop for too long. He said later in his testimony, "I did not know why, but something in the way the car stopped made me look back." The urgency of that moment propelled us out of the car, as if the simple act of opening a door could exorcise the claustrophobia. Once on solid ground, people gathered. A hotel clerk named Peter, who came out with towels, Marcus, who had returned and stood with his jaw tight, and a woman from the ferry line who had seen the car idling for too long. Officer Ruiz arrived within minutes, lights washing the wet pavement in red and blue, questions sharp and immediate. The exchanges with law enforcement were brisk and methodical. "Are you injured?" Officer Ruiz asked me. "No," I said. "Do you want to press charges?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "Describe what happened," he ordered. The driver sat on the curb and kept repeating, "I was only waiting," in a low voice, as if to convince himself that his actions had a mundane explanation. At that point, I had to tell a story to make sense of a nightmare. The immediate response from the crowd and the quick arrival of police contained the event, but did not explain why it had happened. The containment that night involved a few key procedures that are important to detail. The officer sealed the cab by placing a bright yellow tape across the driver's side door and noting the meter reading. He photographed the interior of the vehicle with a phone and with a departmental camera, and he asked for identification from everyone involved. The man was detained, and his personal effects were placed into an evidence bag with a chain of custody tag attached, logged by Officer Ruiz and signed by the arresting officer. The dispatcher, Elena, called the company to report the incident, and an internal review of rides was initiated. Later, Detective Morales told me that the first steps in a case like this include collecting CCTV from nearby intersections, downloading the driver's route history, interviewing passengers, and gathering any audio recordings from inside the cab which may be available on the company device. This procedural description is brief but important because it shows the initial forensic approach. The bagged items, the photographs, and the log entries allow investigators to maintain a secure chain of custody as evidence is transferred from street level to precinct locker to laboratory. The man was taken to the station for questioning and then held until bail could be decided. The way authorities processed the scene felt clinical and deliberate, in contrast with the raw panic we felt moments earlier. The investigation widened in the days that followed. Statements were collected from me, from Marcus, from Javier, and from Peter, the hotel clerk. A careful review of complaint logs revealed that the man had multiple prior reports of locking doors and refusing to allow exits, but none had led to prosecution because witnesses were scarce or statements were inconsistent. Detective Morales explained over a coffee 2 days later that patterns in small crimes often only emerge when someone chooses to pull them together into a timeline. People commit similar acts in different places, and no one connects them until someone looks, he said. He told me that they were checking for any links to other reports, looking for a motive, and whether the driver had a history of aggression or of mental health complaints. He asked detailed questions about the tone of the man's voice, about his hands, about odors, and about how quickly the car moved after we stepped out. These questions were clinical but necessary. The investigation moved from the immediate to the structural as the local media picked up the story and passengers like me were asked to give statements on camera. Headlines did what headlines always do, compressing complexity into a few punchy words. Word spread, and the taxi company that employed the driver released a statement saying they took passenger safety seriously and that they were reviewing driver files. The presence of the press made the small city feel larger and more invasive. I could not walk down Harbor Street without someone asking me for a quote. That public reaction was a new pressure that had institutional consequences. In the weeks after the incident, the company instituted a quick review of driver locking policies and retraining modules. They rolled out a reminder to drivers by email about when it is acceptable to secure doors and how to report suspicious behavior by passengers without putting someone at risk. These changes were small but significant. The chain of events from the 4 rides forced a reckoning about how much power a driver holds in a small enclosed vehicle and how vulnerable passengers can be when alone. During the time the case was active, I experienced a cascade of emotions. There were moments of intense fear that lasted only seconds but felt like hours, like the seconds in the car before the doors opened. There were moments of shame, the absurd and private shame of asking for help, of not anticipating danger. There were hours of anger at the man who refused to unlock the doors and at systems that had allowed complaints to pile up with no consequence. There were also moments of gratitude that strangers like Javier had the presence of mind to tap the window and to risk confrontation. The arc of the journey included 5 high-tension moments that I will unpack because they reveal how the narrative of danger unfolded and why it felt so large. The first moment was the initial refusal in Sam's cab. The sound of the central lock clicking but not releasing, the tightness of the driver's jaw, the smell of smoke and rain. The way the radio grew thin and distant like an old record. It felt like time compressed. For 500 to 600 characters, let me say that in that instant, the ordinary made no sense, and fear had a texture. The second moment came when Nina whispered that her partner liked to watch her. The vulnerability in her voice, the bruise barely visible at her collar, the way Elena's hands tugged the blanket over Nina's legs as if to cover more than cold, created a potency of dread that lingered. The third moment arrived in the story Javier told about hearing something that made him follow the car. The city in his account became a theater, the car a moving stage where invisible things happened behind curtains. The fourth moment was the knock on the rear window in my final ride. The sharp percussion was a punctuation mark that snapped the scene open. The fifth intense moment happened at the station when the man refused to give a clear motive and kept repeating the same sentence like a recording. Each of these moments stretched between 500 to 600 characters in my memory, and in my retelling became scenes that replay in detail.
At about this point in the story, I want to pause and address anyone watching because I know this material can be difficult. I know that hearing about closed doors and refusal can bring back things people thought they had put away. I felt that too when I recount it even now. If you have experienced anything similar, please say yes and then tell
us where and what happened. Your simple words help others understand patterns and provide data that can keep someone safe. If you have never been in a situation like this, I still want to hear from you. Do you lock your doors automatically in taxis or ride shares, or do you ask another passenger to sit in the middle seat if you are alone? Begin your comment with yes or no, and then a short sentence like this. Yes, I was followed in a cab in Boston. No, I always take the bus in my city. Sharing a few words helps create a map of experiences that can influence conversations about safety protocols and company policies. Your stories matter, and they help other people feel less alone when they decide to speak out. After the initial public attention, the legal and institutional consequences began to appear. The man was charged with unlawful detention and reckless endangerment and held for a preliminary hearing. At the hearing, testimonies from Marcus, Javier, Peter, and me were read into the record. The prosecutor spoke with a voice that tried to make sense of small acts as criminal patterns. The defense argued that no actual physical harm had occurred and that the man had acted out of confusion or a lack of judgment, putting the case into a contested space between misconduct and crime. There were mugshots and a booking report and a cautious public debate about whether more training for drivers or more stringent background checks would have prevented the event. The taxi company faced scrutiny, and the local transit authority opened an inquiry into licensing oversight. Our hearing, Detective Morales presented a careful timeline and referenced audio from the cab which corroborated many details. The man pleaded not guilty and was released on bail with mandatory check-ins and a court-ordered requirement to surrender his vehicle keys on the nights he was scheduled to drive. That last stipulation was odd and fragile, but it felt like an attempt to create immediate safety. In the weeks after the incident, the atmosphere on the street changed. I noticed fewer people getting into cabs at 3 in the morning, more people calling friends to walk them to the door, more hotel clerks like Peter watching cars with narrowed eyes. Drivers seemed more constrained by company policy, and there were polite but awkward conversations between passengers and drivers about locking practices. It felt like a collective holding of breath and a slow exhale. There were also ripple effects. Complaints that had sat idle were reopened, the company revised its training manual, and a city council member proposed an ordinance requiring dash cameras and stronger reporting protocols. The man who refused to unlock the doors became a name in a file and a cautionary example in news segments. He eventually entered a plea bargain for a reduced charge in exchange for attending anger management and mental health evaluations. The legal case closed with terms that felt partial and unsatisfying to many, but which represented for some a measure of accountability. In the months that followed, I kept a journal to try to make sense of what had happened and why I had been there. The epilogue of this story unfolds in 3 temporal moments that track personal change, institutional response, and lingering memory, and they deserve space because endings are rarely clean. 1 month after the incident, I was still jumpy. I would glance reflexively at a taximeter and count the seconds before a driver started the engine. I met with Elena over coffee, and she told me she had been fielding calls from passengers who wanted assurances. We went through the company's new protocol that required drivers to verbally confirm the destination and to make an offering to stop in a well-lit area if any passenger requested it. I learned that Marcus had submitted an official statement and that Javier had declined to be interviewed further, saying he had done what he could and wanted no more attention. I wrote a piece for a local outlet about my experience, and the comments that followed were a mix of empathy, disbelief, and practical suggestions. 1 month felt like a short loop of action and reaction, a quick attempt to repair trust. 3 months after the event, the ripple had reached policy. The City Transit Authority announced a pilot program to equip taxis with real-time GPS monitoring that would flag prolonged stops and send alerts to a central dispatcher. The company had introduced mandatory refresher training for all drivers and had instituted a clearer complaint escalation path.
Detective Morales told me that their unit had been able to connect a handful of similar complaints across different jurisdictions and that a broader investigation was ongoing. I met with a small group of passengers who had been affected, and we shared what we learned about how to de-escalate, how to document, and how to make a report that would have weight. Our community conversation had shifted from individual fear to collective action. 6 months later, things felt different but not resolved. The man who refused to unlock the doors had completed the terms of his plea agreement and was ordered into community service and evaluation. The taxi company had installed cameras in a subset of the fleet and reported fewer complaints about locked doors. For me, the memory of the cold hand on the central lock and the metallic taste of fear remained sharp in certain triggers: a closing door, a sudden stop, the sound of a tapping at a window. I found myself preferring daytime buses and taking routes that kept me in sight of people I trusted. Yet there were also surprising outcomes. I reconnected with people I had met that summer, like Marcus, who sent me a note months later saying that the incident had changed him too and that he had started attending a neighbor watch meeting. Elena became an advocate in the company for passenger safety, pushing for policies that balanced driver discretion with passenger rights. Peter continued to be a slow, careful presence at the hotel door. Looking back 6 months later, I could see both the small institutional improvements and the personal traces that the events left on me and others. In conclusion, the 4 rides were a sequence of moments that shrank the world of a taxi down to a sliver where fear could become a physical thing. The impact was immediate and then fractal, touching different lives and nudging institutions to change. I still hear the soft click of a lock sometimes when I close a cab door, and the sound takes me back to the night when a man refused to unlock the doors. The legal outcome was imperfect, and the policies that emerged were cautious but necessary. The people who helped me stand out: Sam, who later called to say he was sorry and that he had filed a report; Nina, who learned to speak up and whose small courage mattered; Marcus, who stayed by my side; Javier, who tapped the window; Officer Ruiz and Detective Morales, who translated panic into process; and Peter the clerk, who offered towels and a witness. If this story moved you and you want more accounts told with care and detail, subscribe so you do not miss future episodes. At the end of the day, I learned that being visible and speaking up can change the smallest moment from a private fear into a public act of accountability. If you have ever been in a cab and felt the wrongness of locked doors or a refusal to let you out, say yes and tell us a few words about where and what happened in the comments. Your voice can help someone else decide to knock or to call or to step in. Thank you for listening to these 4 rides and for staying with me through the rain and the locked doors and the small acts of courage that opened them.